What is truth? More than ever, the answer seems confusing, but today I'll talk about what truth isn't, what it is, and how history helps us determine it. We'll then preview how the Bible measures up to the historical standards for truth. Hi, I'm Yvonne Pren, and welcome to Bible 805, where you can learn to trust, know, and apply the Bible. Let's get started on our topic today. What is truth? How history and the Christian faith answers. Before we begin, this lesson is part of a three-part foundational series that's entitled How Truth and History Confirm That We Can Trust the Christian Bible. Though each lesson is useful on its own, all three of the lessons in this series go together for a complete understanding of the topic. The three lessons in this series are: number one, what is truth? How history and the Christian faith answer. Number two, how historians evaluate the reliability of the Christian Bible. And number three, why the Christian Bible is unique among all other scriptures. Please plan to listen or watch all of these parts for a full understanding of the topic of why we can trust the Christian Bible. They're available in podcast or video formats. Just go to www.bible805.com for the links to all of the different ways that you can take in this information. Now back to the question, what is truth? More than ever, it's an important question. Fake news, conflicting viewpoints, frightening world events, how do we know what to believe? On one level, if the confusion over truth were just confined to the political realm or whatever tragedy consumes the news, one option would be to block the media noise and hope things get better. But we can't do that in all of life. Some areas matter much more than the latest political media event or even the latest on the pandemic, and truth in those areas can have eternal consequences. In spiritual realities, truth matters. The Bible says God put eternity in our hearts. We can't help but think spiritual thoughts, so we ask questions like this. We know we'll live forever, but the question is, in which neighborhood? A neighborhood of joy, or sorrow, or oblivion? Is there a God who watches us and will someday judge us? Where do we go for forgiveness? And how are we to live this life now with peace and purpose? It's hard enough to find truthful answers to these questions, but we have one more problem. We start at a disadvantage because we have an enemy working against us. Finding spiritual truth is never easy because in reality, as Ephesians 6:12 tells us, our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. And our enemy doesn't play fair. 2 Corinthians tells us that Satan masquerades as an angel of light. And John tells us that he is a liar and the father of lies. Lies are not always obvious, and they may be extremely appealing. My husband and I had a single adult ministry for many years, and I would always tell our single adults, if you met Satan in the flesh today, he wouldn't have a pitchfork and horns and be red and ugly and all that. Not at all. He would look like he just stepped off the cover of GQ magazine. He would be charming. He would be lovely. He would be kind. He would be incredibly handsome. And Satan is like that. He will often disguise himself and the things that are really evil by making them look good on the surface. And I know every single one of us has fallen for something that looked really good at first, but then it wasn't. But that is how the enemy operates. That is why we need a source of truth outside ourselves to determine truth. Truth is not easy to determine, but it is essential for life now and forever. Here are some different quotes that I think are just kind of useful as we get started. Aldous Huxley said, "Facts do not cease to exist because they're ignored." Khaled Hosseini said, "But better to be hurt by the truth than comforted with a lie." And Elvis Presley even had a great quote on this. He said, "Truth is like the sun. You can shut it out for a time, but it ain't going away." And last, in a time of deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act. George Orwell said that. So let's be brave, let's be revolutionary, and let's look for truth. And in our exploration of truth, first we're going to look at what it is not. Truth is not what works. Now, let me just give sort of a verbal citation here. A number of the things that I'll be sharing in the next little while come from the Baker Encyclopedia of Apologetics. Norm Geisler edited that, and he also said some of the things, or things that I based on what I'm going to be talking about, but I did want to give credit where credit is due there. William James said, "A statement is known to be true if it brings the right result." A lot of people think that. But a brief consideration shows it isn't the case at all. In life, lies, cheating, adultery can all bring about short-term, seemingly positive results. In religion, to say all religions are true and all lead to the same place may accomplish a short-term goal of peace with others and sound kind and tolerant. But it's like not telling someone they have cancer because you don't want them to feel bad. But if you don't tell them the truth, regardless of how they will feel, they can't make appropriate decisions about their future. It's similar with the statement, all religions are true. If it's not true, it can have eternally disastrous results for the people who believe that. Truth is also not what is internally consistent. Now, one of the best examples of how this works is the internally consistent world of science fiction movies. For example, whether it's a Marvel Universe, Star Trek, or Star Wars, their movies are based on a belief system that is internally consistent within that universe. But being consistent within the movie doesn't make that world true. We all know, or we should know, that the Force in Star Wars is an invention of George Lucas, and that Thor, Iron Man, and the Hulk are not going to save the Earth. We know Spider-Man won't swoop in to save someone in real life, even though we totally believe he'll do that in the movie. But sadly, that's how some people evaluate religion. A religious system might make sense internally. The stories within it might be consistent with the belief system on which it is founded. And I'm going to be giving you a lot of examples of that in the third lesson of this series, so please do stick around for that. This will all make much more sense, like I said earlier, when you have all three lessons together. But keep that in mind, that a religious system might have this internal mythology, if you will, history of stories, whatever, that makes sense within that religion. But if that belief system, no matter how ancient or revered it is, if it's not based on reality in the physical, historical world, if it's based on fables and legends, it makes about as much sense to trust it for eternal salvation as it would be to trust the Force. Truth also is not what feels good. The popular subjective view is that truth gives us a satisfying feeling and error feels bad. In religion, many people believe things because it makes them feel. Now, it really feels good to think that you can live your life however you want, and at the end of it, everybody gets to step into the light to waiting loved ones. It's so much more comforting than having to think about guilt or sin or any eternal penalties for it. But just because this belief feels good does not make it true. Feelings do not validate objective reality. Feelings don't define truth. Truth is also not relative. There are not different truths for different people. And again, this is a really popular view today. You know, I have my truth, you have yours. But when you think about it, it violates the basic logic of the law of non-contradiction. In life, either you have two red shoes on or you don't. Either you have blue eyes or you don't. In religion, either Jesus died on the cross or he didn't. Either Jesus is God or he isn't. How do we decide what's true about Jesus? Now, different religions answer this in different ways. All religions agree that Jesus existed, but Muslims believe he was a prophet, but he wasn't God. Mormons use many of the same terms to describe Jesus as do Orthodox Christians, but they don't have the same meaning in those terms. Hindus, Buddhists, and many people believe Jesus was a good man, he was a good teacher, but they say he was no different than many others, and all of us can aspire to be the same kind of person that Jesus was. However, here's what Jesus said about himself. He said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." He was saying that the only true way to know God and have our sins forgiven and an eternal relationship with God is through him, through Jesus. Now, not all the previously mentioned views of Jesus can be true because they're mutually exclusive. Jesus can't be God and not God. If what Jesus said about himself is true, the other views of him are false. So, how do we decide what's true? Not only in religion, but in every other area. If truth is not in these things that I'm going to review in just a minute, what is it? Truth is not, as we just talked about, what works. It's not what is internally consistent. It's not what feels good. It's not relative. There are not different truths for different people. Truth actually has a pretty simple definition. The Merriam-Webster dictionary defines truth in this way. It says it's the body of real things, events, and facts, the property of being in accord with fact or reality. Norm Geisler puts it this way: truth is telling it like it is. Falsehood, then, is what does not correspond. It tells it like it is not, misrepresenting the way things are. The intent behind the statement is irrelevant. If it lacks proper correspondence, it is false. The conclusion then is truth is what corresponds to reality. So how do we find out what corresponds to reality? Now, not in a large philosophical sense, but how does it apply to what we believe? What's real? What's true? To answer that, I want to share my story. I want to share how I answered that question because all of us must answer this question at some time in our life for ourselves. This is not an apologetic argument. There are many good resources for those sorts of things online. It's simply my story. I'm not a professional theologian or a philosopher. I'm one follower of Jesus, sharing how I answered my questions about the truth of the Christian faith with the hope that it might help others. We all have to answer that question at some time about what is true, what isn't, what's true about Jesus, and this is how I did it. I grew up in the church. I was involved in the church. I taught Sunday school literally all my life, and I loved it. Now, I should probably explain a little bit more. If you know me, you've heard me say this before, but when I say I taught Sunday school literally all my life, that's pretty true. When I was in third grade, I started helping with the kindergartners in Sunday school. When I was in sixth grade, I had my own little class of fourth graders. When I got into high school, my high school sponsors of the youth group had to leave, and we were a fairly small church. And I said, well, I think I could do that. So at age 16, I took over the youth group, and I ran that for a number of years, and have literally taught Sunday school classes, small groups, all sorts of things related to the church ever since then. But then I got to a place as a young adult where I questioned, is the Christian faith really true? I come from a strong faith background, and how did I know that my faith wasn't just an emotional response to the people that I loved? Was I just kind of buying the party line because that's what everybody else believed in? I decided I had to do something to figure this out, and here's what I decided to do. Now, I honestly don't know where this came from, although now I believe it was God's leading. But as I questioned my faith, I decided that the way to answer this question on whether it was true or not was to get a master's degree in history, majoring on the history of the church. Now, again, I look back and I almost have to laugh because even though I kind of liked history, my undergraduate degrees were in English and education. And in fact, I'd only taken one history class in all of my undergraduate time. I had to actually go back and do all these prerequisites before I could take the history, before I could even apply to get this master's degree in history. But for some reason, I decided that I needed to do that. And this is why I thought that if I could examine what was true in the Christian faith throughout all of history, that'd be a good evidence that it was foundationally true. I also decided to do my studies at a secular university because I didn't want what I studied to be influenced by Christian bias. I knew if I went to a Christian school, they'd say all this was true and all this really happened and all that. I didn't want that. I wanted to go to a secular school. Several years and lots of study later, my hopes were not disappointed. Actually, figuring out what was true in the Christian faith as far as the different things that happened and when and where and all of that, that was easy. It's historically verified all over the place. I'd heard accusations about various things happening where the Bible said this and it really wasn't true, and where, this was written and it was a false thing and whatever. That was just not true. The things that the Bible said were true, and historically these different things did happen, and that was a great relief. Again, particularly since I studied at a secular university and my master professor was quite antagonistic to Christianity. So when I learned and researched and found out that the basic facts were true, that was such a relief. The evidence was clear. And I'll share quite a bit of that as we go along, and particularly as I get into the overview of the Bible. But more important than just simply coming to the conclusion that these different facts were correct was that I learned to think like a historian. I learned how important it is to look at events in their historical setting to fully understand them. I learned what to look for to prevent bias and untrue conclusions. And by the way, I fall back on that all the time as I'm preparing these lessons. I'll come to a conclusion, then I'll think, nope, I must check negative sources, I must check other viewpoints, I must check this and that. And I do that because I was trained to think historically. After graduate school, I did attend seminary, but I liked it. That was great. But in all honesty, that really didn't help me in any exploration of what's true. Of course, in seminary, they all believe it's true, but it did help me in applying it and in some other areas. In my teaching, and again, always there's been a Sunday school class or something. Now with the pandemic, it's online, but that's where I'm doing it here in these classes. I found myself constantly going back to what I'd learned as a historian to evaluate the truth of what I was teaching, because history is a valid way to determine what corresponds with reality, and I'm going to be doing that in all of the future lessons. But now let's look at how historians look at the world, and then I'll apply this to how we determine truth in religion. How determining historical truth ties into the search for religious truth. It seems to me, and some might disagree, that for a religion to be true theologically, it should also have a historical, factual basis. Of course, there are intangibles in any religion that can't be proven. To some, it requires a blind leap of faith to participate in any religion, and though, of course, every religion requires a response of our will that is more than just an acknowledgement of facts, I believe that God, as a creator of reality, left us discoverable, verifiable evidence of his work. That is why the Christian faith claims that it is, and this is super important, the Christian faith claims it is historical and evidential. This claim is extraordinarily, as I said, important. And what's interesting, and you'll see this particularly as we get to the lesson on other religions, it's far more unique than you'd imagine. This means that Christianity believes their faith is based on true history, based on true evidence. That was my conclusion personally after my many years of study, and I wanted to share that with you. That's why I'm doing this whole Bible 805 and all these sorts of things. By the way, I named my podcast and my website and the training school and all these sorts of things Bible 805 because 805 is a real area code, a real place. My logo is of a palm tree that's in my front yard. And I believe the messages in the Bible are just as real and tangible as where I live. This is such a foundational aspect of the Christian faith. We don't even often think about it, but allow me to go over some examples of it. I'll go into how we determine these things more in coming lessons, but let me share just a couple examples of truth written in the Bible that have been proven to be historical and evidential. Again, much more is coming in future lessons. Think of these as kind of like a little movie trailer or whatever for coming attractions. The Bible is full of historical statements that can be verified when it says things like this. In the New Testament, in those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. In the Old Testament, it says, in the 14th year of King Hezekiah's reign, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, attacked all the fortified cities of Judah and captured them. Now, we'd expect these events, these people, to correspond to historical fact if indeed the Christian faith is based on true history. And they do. Every student of history from high school on knows who Caesar Augustus was and that he lived from 63 BC to 14 AD. We have coins, we have statues with his image, we have written histories about him from many sources. Historians have no doubt about his life, about what he did, about this historical decree that was the reason Mary and Joseph had to go to Bethlehem for Jesus' birth. They lived in Nazareth and Bethlehem was 90 miles away. But Bethlehem was where it was prophesied that the Messiah would be born. And it took a decree of Rome to get a pregnant woman and her husband to walk the 90 brutal, dangerous, and cold miles to get there. Here is a description of what the actual trip would have been like. And before I read you some excerpts of that, let me just say, and when I was researching things on this, it was interesting because numerous writers said the ideas that we have of Mary riding on the donkey and, Joseph beside her and all of that are obviously historically totally false. They were a poor family. They would not have had a donkey for her to ride on. She had to walk those 90 miles. And this is what it was like. Professor James F. Strange, he's a New Testament and Biblical Archaeology professor. He has a description of it. This was actually in the LA Times, which I thought was kind of interesting. And history not only gives us overall facts and people, but when we really study it, and he studied it quite a bit, and he would take people on these excavation team tours in the areas that he's talking about, so he knew it really well. And by the way, they are actual areas that we can identify today. Keep that in mind because not all religions have that. But anyway, he was very familiar with the history and what happened. And here are some of the things that he says. He says the world of Mary and Joseph was a difficult and dangerous place. He says we have no idea how difficult it actually was. He said that it was a fairly grueling trip. This trip was very much uphill and downhill. It was not simple. He estimated that Mary and Joseph would likely have traveled only 10 miles a day because of Mary's impending delivery. And the trip through the Judean desert would have taken place during the winter, when it was in the 30s during the day and rains like heck, he said. It's nasty, miserable. At night it would be freezing. And the unpaved hilly trails and harsh weather were not the only hazards Mary and Joseph would have faced on their journey south. One of the most terrifying dangers in ancient Palestine was the heavily forested valley of the Jordan River. Lions and bears lived in the woods, and travelers had to fend off wild boars. Archaeologists have unearthed documents warning travelers of the forest dangers, he said. And bandits, pirates of the desert, and robbers were also common hazards. Mary and Joseph had to bring their own provisions. In wineskins they carried water, and they carried a lot of bread. Breakfast would be dried bread, lunch would be oil with bread, and herbs with oil and bread in the evening. The hardships did not end when Joseph and Mary arrived in Bethlehem. And we know the rest of the story. But the reason I'm reading this is just to give you a sense of how history can fill in and confirm the facts that are in the Bible, showing us that Christianity is historical and evidential. Again, this is just an introduction. In the coming year, when I go through the whole Bible and we read through that, I will give you many, many more historical confirmations of things. The Old Testament example, now it's a little bit more unfamiliar, but it's really interesting and it's just as true and significant. Note this pillar here that you're able to see. And not as many people have heard about or are as familiar with Sennacherib. I did have a friend, though, that named his German Shepherd Sennacherib. I thought that was pretty cool. He was a pastor. But anyway, he was an Assyrian ruler, but we have his extensive historical verification about a particular passage about him. Now, the verification is found on Sennacherib's pillars or his prisms. That's what this is. It's a six-sided pillar, and back in those days, rulers loved to talk about themselves, and so he had all of his history recorded on these pillars, and it's in little teeny weeny cuneiform writing, but it's actually very clear, very legible, very easy to decipher if you know cuneiform, which of course I don't, but I'm trusting that what they said is true. We actually have at least three of them. He scattered them all over his empire because he didn't want people to forget about him, and we haven't. There's one in the British Museum, one in the Oriental Institute of Chicago, and one in Jerusalem. But what it says in one little passage, he's talking about Hezekiah, and he says, "As for the king of Judah, Hezekiah, who had not submitted to my authority, I besieged and captured 46 of his fortified cities, along with many smaller towns taken in battle with my battering rams. As for Hezekiah, I shut him up like a caged bird in his royal city of Jerusalem." This is extraordinary historical evidence from almost 3,000 years ago that tells the Assyrian view of the biblical account in 2 Chronicles 32. Now, I'm going to share lots more about this when we actually go through that passage, but I thought that you would find even this little tidbit interesting. Now, of course, there are limits to history. We must acknowledge that just because you can trust the historical veracity of the Bible doesn't mean you automatically trust the God of the Bible. But it's a good foundation. If the truth of the Christian faith claims to be historical and evidential, we must start there. Committing to faith will require more than checking off a list, verifying the documents and geography of a faith, but it shouldn't claim less if it claims to be a faith that will forgive sins, give meaning and purpose to life, and grant eternal salvation. Helping you do that is the purpose of Bible 805. So check out the website www.bible805.com for more. To review, this lesson is part of a three-part series, How Truth and History Confirm That We Can Trust the Christian Bible. We just went over this lesson, what is truth, and how history and the Christian Bible answers. Next is how historians evaluate the reliability of the Christian Bible. We'll actually look at how we date documents. I think you'll find that fascinating. And then the number 3 is why the Christian Bible is unique among all other scriptures. At any time, to review the lessons, go to www.bible805.com for links to the various media versions and resources related to these lessons. In closing, I'm Yvonne Pren with Bible 805, where you can learn to know, trust, and apply the Bible. And may God give you strength and joy as you serve Him today and always.